The texts of Leviticus 3 and 4 operate as highly codified procedural law. They function essentially as a technical manual for an ancient system. This blueprint outlines the ancient Israelite tabernacle. It reveals a specific spatial geography, one that required exact biological inputs from a sacrificial animal to operate correctly. We are going to analyze two distinct operational states within this geography: the peace offering, detailed in Chapter 3, and the sin offering in Chapter 4. Tracing the exact procedural shifts between these two texts reveals an underlying algorithmic logic governing Israelite ritual mechanics. A fallible human population lived in direct proximity to a holy, terrifyingly powerful deity. They required an exact weaponized biological mechanism to survive that exposure. Leviticus 3 establishes the tabernacle system's baseline, or control state. This is the peace offering, a standard operating procedure for fellowship between the Israelites and the divine. This diagram breaks down the required anatomy of the sacrificial animal, whether an ox or a sheep. The priest must isolate specific visceral components: the fat covering the entrails, the kidneys, the liver lobe, and the fat tail. Once extracted, this concentrated mass is moved to the altar of burnt offering for complete oxidation. This establishes the first axiom of the system: visceral fat is strictly categorized as the exclusive metabolic fuel for the deity. The system relies on a second biological component: blood. Leviticus 3 verse 17 issues a strict, immutable prohibition. Humans are absolutely forbidden from consuming either the fat or the blood. While the fat is burned as fuel, the blood is exclusively reserved for spatial application. In this baseline state, the protocol is straightforward. The priest simply splashes the blood against the base of the outer altar on all sides. This baseline state maintains systemic equilibrium. It permanently separates the biological portion designated for the divine from any human utility. Chapter 4 introduces the system's alert state. An unintentional sin or misstep in the law triggers the purification or sin offering. This offering operates as a rigorous, conditional algorithm, responding directly to the specific status of the offender. This matrix categorizes the text's social hierarchy. For the top tier, the priest or congregation, the system requires a physically flawless bull. The mid-tier leader requires a male goat, and at the baseline tier, a commoner must provide a female goat or lamb. The conditional logic is clear. The value of the required biological hardware scales directly with the social influence of the offender. Yet amidst these shifting variables, there is a critical procedural constant. The extraction and burning of the visceral fat remains completely identical to Chapter 3. The divine fuel requirement is immutable, regardless of human failure. The algorithm only alters the handling of the blood and the carcass. In Chapter 4, blood functions as a ritual detergent, deployed specifically to neutralize moral contamination. This map traces Path A, the spatial trajectory of blood following the sin of a leader or a commoner. The vector stops precisely at the outer courtyard altar. For these individual sins, the blood vector never enters the inner tent of meeting. The priest applies the blood directly to the physical, raised horns on the corners of the outer stone altar. Path A proves that individual offenses only contaminate the outermost layer of the sanctuary's geography. This animation traces Path B, required when the priest or congregation sins. The blood vector penetrates deeply into the inner tent of meeting. The priest sprinkles it before the veil, smears it onto the inner altar, and dumps the remainder at the outer altar's base. The text maps out a radioactivity of guilt. Higher social status generates a contamination that penetrates deeper into the divine space. The spatial depth of the blood vector acts as a direct physical measurement of the community's moral contamination. The sharpest procedural divergence between Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 lies in the ultimate disposal of the animal's carcass. In the baseline peace offering, once the fat is burned and the blood is splashed, the remaining meat is utilized and eaten in fellowship. In the high-level sin offering, the animal effectively acts as a substitutionary sponge, absorbing the community's guilt. The priest must gather the hide, the meat, the head, the legs, the entrails, and the dung. Because this material has absorbed systemic contamination, the strict protocol dictates it absolutely cannot be utilized or eaten. This diagram plots the required physical removal of the carcass, drawing a spatial vector from the center of the tabernacle out to an isolated node designated outside the camp. In this quarantine zone, the remains are completely incinerated. This total destruction is necessary to reset the system, clearing the error from the camp. High-level sins transform the animal into a biohazard, demanding a disposal sequence identical to hazardous waste removal to preserve systemic purity. This logic tree summarizes our findings. The protocols in Leviticus 3 and 4 function as a rigorous spatial and biological equation. The peace offering branch functions as the mechanism for maintaining baseline systemic equilibrium. Conversely, the sin offering branch acts as a multi-tiered, complex error correction protocol. We observe that spatial depth and carcass disposal correlate precisely to the social gravity of contamination. This text preserves the mechanical framework of an ancient civilization, logically architecting a system to survive the terrifying proximity of the divine.